It has rung 9 times now. 9 times. And I can feel my pulse slowing down to match it. If you are hearing this recording, if you found the ledger and the tape tucked inside the back cover, then you need to understand something before you take another step inside this building. The bells are not ringing. That is the whole of the problem. That is everything you need to know. The bells are not ringing. My name is Callum Drest. I was 23 years old when the guild sent me out to the echo chamber gap. Apprentice cataloger, 3rd rank. The lowest rank there is, which is precisely why they sent me and not someone they were particularly attached to keeping. The Guild of Resonant Instruments, and I understand if that name means nothing to you, because it meant very little to me before all of this. They are a quiet organization, old. They concern themselves with instruments that have been misused, bells mostly, tuning forks, devices that interact with sound in ways that go a step or two beyond what most people would call natural. They catalog such things. They contain such things. And sometimes, when something has been left alone in the mountains for long enough, they send an apprentice to go and fetch the paperwork. That is what I was. Paperwork retrieval. Echo Chamber Gap sits in a long crease between 2 ridges in the far southwestern corner of Ashe County. The mountains there are old, older than most. The limestone underneath has been dissolving for so long that the whole region is riddled through with cavities the size of cathedrals, though you would never know it standing on the surface. The ground just looks like ground. Dark soil, quartzite outcroppings, rhododendron so thick you have to turn sideways to pass through it. What you notice first, before you notice anything else, is the quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of an early mountain morning, where the silence is full of small things, the drip of dew off a leaf, the far-off percussion of a woodpecker working a dead pine. This is a different order of silence. It sits on your eardrums like a palm pressed flat against them. Not painful, just present, like the valley is holding its breath and waiting to see what you will do. There were no birds in that valley, no bird song, no rustle of something small retreating through the brush at my approach. Even the creek, a black ribbon of water running alongside the old logging trail, seemed quieter than it ought to have been, as though the sound of it was being absorbed before it could properly travel. foundry came into view around dusk. I had expected ruin. The site had been abandoned since the 1880s, a small bell foundry, one of perhaps a dozen that had existed in the southern Appalachians during that period. I had expected collapsed walls, a chimney stack standing alone over a floor of weeds and broken stone. The foundry was largely intact. Limestone walls mortared with a clay mixture that had hardened into something closer to concrete than mud. The roof had partially caved in on the northern end, and the great wooden doors had warped off their hinges, leaving a gap just wide enough for a person to turn sideways and slide through, which I did. The smell inside was the first thing. Old foundries smell of char and iron, of burnt bone and mineral ash. And this one carried all of those things, but there was something else layered over them, something heavier. I recognized it eventually as the smell of lead. Not fresh cast lead, which has a bright, almost sweet quality, but old lead sitting in the same space for 140 years, releasing that flat, mineral, faintly poisonous scent. The smell of something meant to stop something else from getting out. The bells were on the far wall. Not hanging, they were mounted against the stone, bolted at varying heights, in a pattern I initially took to be practical, but would later understand was quite deliberately spatial. 11 of them, ranging from one no larger than a man's fist to one that must have weighed close to 300 pounds. All of them dark with age, all of them impossibly thick around their lips and crowns. I ran my hand along the lip of the smallest one. The lead lining was interior. The outside of each bell was standard bronze casting, but the inside had been carefully lined with poured lead, a 1/4-inch shell of it sealed against the bronze with a resin of some kind. I had assumed the lead would be exterior, a dampening measure. Interior lining was something else entirely. Interior lining meant the bells were never meant to be rung. The silver bark ones were in the back room. The door to it was recessed into the wall at an angle that made it invisible unless you were specifically looking. The room behind it was no bigger than a generous closet, and it held 4 more bells, different in character from the first 11. Cast from a material I have still never been able to identify. The surface of each one was slightly rough to the touch, almost organic, like the outer bark of a yellow birch tree rendered in something cold and heavy and faintly luminous. They were not lead-lined. They sat on a low shelf of dressed limestone, and around each one, chalked directly onto the shelf in careful, old-fashioned script, was a single word: anchor, 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 anchor. The ledger was behind the silver bark bells, tucked into a wall cavity sealed with a plug of wax. The wax was old but unbroken. I broke it, because that is what I was there to do. The Guild's founding archivist, a man named Harwell Creed, responsible for establishing this containment site in 1879, had written in a hand that was small and precise and entirely without ornamentation. Most of the ledger was inventory, bell dimensions, alloy compositions, notes on the lead lining process. I skimmed through it in the dim, late light coming through the gap in the roof. The last 12 pages were different. The handwriting was the same, but the entries were no longer inventory. They were notes. The kind of writing a person produces when they are no longer certain that what they are experiencing can be usefully categorized. Creed had not built this foundry to cast bells. He had built it as a containment structure around a phenomenon that had existed in this valley before he arrived. The 11 lead-lined bells were not objects of manufacture. They were objects of approximation. Creed had spent years attempting to produce in metal a form that would interact with a specific frequency the valley itself was generating. The lead lining was to ensure that when the Hollow-Chime resonated through the valley, the bells would absorb the frequency rather than transmit it. Creed called them baffles. He called the whole building a cage. The Hollow-Chime, he wrote, is not a bell. It has never been a bell. It does not exist as an object that can be removed or destroyed. It is a property of this valley's geology. The cavities beneath the limestone, the particular dimensions of the gap between the two ridges, and it resonates at a frequency so close to the natural rhythm of a resting human heart that the body, upon hearing it, mistakes the chime for itself. The heartbeat begins to entrain, to synchronize. The chime slows, the heart follows. Within 12 complete rings of the cycle, a person fully exposed will have been hollowed out. His term, written with the slight shakiness of someone choosing a word they know is inadequate. Their vital rhythm absorbed completely into the frequency of the valley, which does not stop, which cannot be made to stop, which has been ringing beneath this ground since before there were people here to listen to it. The silver bark bells are the anchors. The silver bark alloy resonated at a frequency slightly higher than the chime's fundamental, a kind of interference pattern. If a person kept contact with one of the anchor bells during an active cycle, the entrainment would be disrupted. The heart would find the anchor frequency instead. The person would be, in Creed's careful language, preserved from synchronization. I put the ledger down. And then the first ring happened. It was not a sound. It was the absence of a sound, in a shape that my mind assembled into the memory of a bell. It arrived not through my ears, but through the floor, through the soles of my boots, up through the bones of my legs and into my sternum, where it sat for a long moment like a hand pressing gently inward. My heartbeat slowed. Just a gentle downward adjustment, like a clock being wound back one small notch. Except that I had been counting my pulse out of nervous habit since I entered the foundry, and I knew that 68 had just become 64. I put both hands around the nearest anchor bell and stood there in the dark of that back room, holding on to a piece of metal I didn't fully understand. And I waited. The second ring came maybe 10 minutes after the first. I felt it in my jaw this time, in the back of my molars, the way you feel the approach of a thunderstorm before you can see the clouds. The silver bark bell hummed faintly under my palms, not ringing, just a slight warming of the metal, the anchor doing what Creed had built it to do. My heart held at 64. The third ring, and the fourth, coming with increasing regularity, the valley tightening around its own frequency, drawing inward, drawing downward, the lead-lined bells absorbing what they could. Creed had built well enough to stretch the 12 rings across hours rather than minutes, giving a person time to find an anchor if they were quick enough and calm enough and lucky enough. I was not calm, but I had the anchor in my hands, and I stood there in the dark, and I breathed. Between the 5th and 6th rings, I found myself thinking about the people who had been in this valley long before Creed arrived, the ones who had known about the chime and named it something older than his clinical term, something passed down in whispers through families that had lived along these ridges for generations, who understood that certain places required a particular kind of respect, a particular kind of distance. They would not have needed a ledger to tell them. They would have felt it in the soil beneath their feet the first time they walked into this hollow, that faint downward pull, that suggestion of a rhythm just beneath the threshold of hearing. And they would have turned around and walked back out without needing any further explanation. The 6th ring arrived. Halfway, 6 rings of 12, and my heart was holding, and the anchor was warm in my hands, and the foundry around me was doing the work it had been built to do. The 7th, the 8th, each one settling into my sternum like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward through my ribs, through my shoulders, along the insides of my arms. I kept my hands on the bell, I kept my breathing slow. Outside, the creek moved through the dark valley. The rhododendron stood dense and still along the ridge walls. The limestone breathed deep below the soil, its ancient cavities cycling the chime through their geometry. A frequency so old it had worn grooves into the bedrock, so patient it had no interest in hurrying. It had been doing this since long before the foundry was built above it. It would go on doing it long after the foundry's walls finally surrendered to the weight of the mountain pressing down around them. The valley did not know about the cage. It did not know about creed or the guild or me. It simply resonated, the way a canyon resonates when wind moves through it, the way a cave resonates when you speak into its dark mouth, and your own voice returns to you changed. The 9th ring. It is rung 9 times now. If you are hearing this, if you found the tape tucked inside the back cover of the ledger, take an anchor bell with you when you leave. Press the silver bark metal against your sternum and feel the faint, warm hum of it, higher than the chime, brighter, stubborn in its interference. Let it argue with the valley on your behalf. The 10th ring settled through the floor and up through my legs and into my hips, and I let it come, and I let it go. The anchor's warmth spreading through my palms and into my wrists, and the stone walls held their positions, and the valley outside kept its long geological silence, that textured palm-flat silence that has been pressing against this hollow since before there were ears here to register it. There is a certain peace in it, a peace I was not expecting. The chime is not malevolent. Creed was careful to note that. It does not intend anything. It is a frequency. It does what frequencies do. It resonates. And in resonating, it seeks resonance in return. The heart is simply the nearest thing that answers. The 11th ring. I am still here. My heart is still mine. The anchor is warm, and the walls are holding. And the creek outside is moving through the dark in its old, unhurried way. And somewhere high above this valley, the sky is full of stars that have no knowledge of any of this, simply burning in their long distances, indifferent and beautiful. The 12th ring is coming. I can feel it gathering the way weather gathers, the way pressure changes before a front moves through. It will arrive when it arrives. The valley does not hurry. I want you to let your body go heavy now. Let the weight of you settle into the floor. into the ground, into the old limestone beneath it. Let the silver bark bell be warm in whatever part of you is still holding on. Let the creek move through the dark, patient and cold, and entirely unconcerned with us. The foundry is quiet. The chime is quiet. Everything is very still. Just hold on. The limestone breathes beneath us, deep and slow. And this gap between the ridges is older than the fear of it, older than the name of it. And it will go on being old, long after this frequency passes through and settles back into the ground, long after we are gone from here, long after every bell in this building has gone cold and still. Hold on. If this hollow found you, there are others waiting. Like this video so the algorithm knows where to send the next one. Subscribe so you're there when the next archive opens. And if you know someone who sleeps better with a little dread in the dark, share it with them. The guild keeps its records. We keep ours. Stay close. Stay quiet. We'll be back.